just going to let people kind of join in here when we're going to get our broadcast going on Facebook as well. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're so thrilled to have you here joining us for our weekly virtual author event series we've been doing since basically St. Patrick's Day. We've been doing mostly Monday and Thursday night events for the past few months, but we've had one or two pop up here and there, and this is one of our Wednesday events, and it's one we're really, really excited about. But I wanted to tell you about a couple of things coming up before we get too far into tonight's discussion. On Monday, the 6th of July, we're going to be talking with Colson Whitehead about the Nickel Boys, his novel, which just won the Pulitzer Prize, 2 for 2, last two novels, not too shabby. One of the cool things about that, though, if you haven't read that book, is the moderator for that event is going to be a reporter named Ben Montgomery, and Ben works for the Tampa Bay Times, but he's also a native Oklahoman and a friend of ours, and a great writer in his own right. Well, Ben is the journalist who did the reporting that Colson Whitehead discovered to write the Nickel Boys. So he wrote the story. So they've never done an event together before, so that should be a really interesting dynamic. That's on Monday night, 7 o'clock. And then, gosh, into the next few weeks, we have a lot of interesting things coming up. I don't want to go through the whole list, so I'll just kind of direct you to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and we're going to keep going with these things for a while. I would imagine we'll be doing virtual events at least through September, if not beyond. And even when we get back to doing some real life things, I bet it will be a hybrid model for a while where we're doing real and virtual events, and they've been great. So stay tuned for that. Really excited to have Lara Prescott with us tonight. She was actually supposed to be with us as one of our headliners for our literary fest in April. And we had this killer lineup, and we were so thrilled to have her here. And then this damn pandemic happened and ruined everything. So we were thrilled, though, to not have to cancel that event and be able to host her. Lara's book, The Secrets We Kept, was really just like one of the breakout books of last year, and just a true knockout. It's, we'll talk a little bit about this, but so many debut novels, they get a lot of hype and you hear about them. And this one certainly had some marketing dollars behind it. And it's hard to always live up to that, but this one definitely did, actually beyond the hype. So that's a really special thing. So we're going to talk about this wonderful novel. We're going to talk about what it's been like having this first year with this really big book, and all that took to get the book done, and much more. So I want to welcome Lara to the event. Welcome to Tulsa virtually.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I hope to come to Tulsa soon, because I hear it is almost like a sister city to Austin. There's like a lot in common between Austinites and people in Tulsa. So
we're competing right now to get Tesla to move here. I think Austin and Tulsa. I personally, I think you guys can take it. I'm good with it. So
I don't want it. I don't want the extra traffic, to be honest.
There you go.
But
yeah.
If it brings jobs, that's okay.
That's true. So it's nice. You're one of our rare authors that's actually on our same time zone, because like you said, you're in Austin. Everybody's usually on the East or West Coast. Yep. So we didn't have to play the what time is it game too much. But I want to congratulate you on this book. It's a pretty stellar feat for a debut, and I know that the book was a pretty major labor of love for quite a long time. But for those who have not read the book or don't know what the book is, I mean, it's very easy to kind of digest, or to kind of bring it down to the basic idea of that this book about how Boris Pasternak's Doctor Zhivago was kind of secretly gotten out of Russia through spies and all these, and those are the kind of buzzwords on the jacket. But what is the book about? And I'm more curious why this topic kind of got inside of you and didn't let go, as opposed to any other story or idea that you could have had.
I mean, I think there's a couple things. So one, my name is Lara. I was named after the heroine of Doctor Zhivago. Everyone asks me that. So I grew up loving Doctor Zhivago. First, the movie, the David Lean 1965 film, which is an absolute classic. I highly recommend it. And then when I was in high school, I finally read the novel for myself, and it became a touchstone novel for me where I'd read it every few years. And every time I read it, I would take something different away from it. You know, when I was in high school, I was interested in a love story. When I was living in Washington, D.C. and working in politics, I was really interested in how this book was a banned book and how it was used as a form of propaganda during the Cold War, because I myself was writing what I would consider propaganda. I was writing ads and stump speeches for politicians. And when I was becoming a writer and I quit politics and put it aside, I was really taken by Boris's sentences on the poetic language he uses. And it's just been this book that's so important to me. And but right before I moved to Austin, Texas, I went to the Michener Center for Writers. I had a fellowship there. I was sent an article from my dad about how the CIA used it as a tool of propaganda during the Cold War, Dr. Zhivago, that is. And I was absolutely struck with the possibility that a book could be used as a weapon, and that governments believed in the power of literature so much to weaponize it. And what does that mean for the author? What does that mean for the reader? And I had to find out everything I could about it. I spent so much time on CIA.gov downloading their PDFs of their redacted documents detailing this mission. And it was almost as if all of these interests in my life were brought together to fuel this obsession to write this novel. You know, my interest in Dr. Zhivago itself, but then my interest in propaganda and government interference and history, it all came together. And as soon as I, heard about it, I began like a year of research before I even put pen to paper and started writing it. But that's kind of the background of this obsession. I think all books start with some sort of obsession, whether
are you an obsessive person by nature? Are you obsessive by nature?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think once I find something, I really like dig my hooks into it. And with this, I became obsessed with collecting artifacts that were related to Dr. Zhivago, whether it's first editions or the CIA's edition or brochures from the World's Fair. Like, I started collecting all of these things to surround myself with them and help inspire me. But I'm moving on to new obsessions, which is good, because something with your first novel, I think you have to have that passion for it that takes you through the years that it takes to write the novel. And when you're done with that first novel, you're like, oh my gosh, will I ever care about something so much again to actually live and breathe the work for as long as it takes to write it? And hopefully, I think I've, started that new obsession, which has a lot of the same similar themes, but
That's
I
good.
can't get away from it.
It's good to kind of move on to something after you've spent so much time. It's probably that's a healthy thing.
Trying to. If writing's a healthy thing, I don't know.
Well, I'm curious to know, a lot of people, I don't think most people understand that, or don't get what a big deal Boris Pasternak was in Russia even before this book, because this was his first novel.
Yes.
And I think most Americans probably don't know any work by Boris Pasternak besides Dr. Zhivago, but he obviously won the Nobel Prize. He was a major poet before this novel and had a reputation that was like rock star status.
Yes.
Can you kind of tell us like who was Boris Pasternak and what his kind of place in the world was, when he was at his height?
Yeah, I mean, I think Boris Pasternak would be considered to be one of the most famous living Soviet writers at the time, one of the most famous poets in the world, and he primarily was known as a poet. Dr. Zhivago was his first and last novel, so that was what he considered his masterwork, but for years and years and years, he was a poet, and he was so famous. And it's hard to imagine this in the current state of affairs. Hopefully, we can imagine a poet rising to this heights of celebrity again. But he would sell out these giant auditoriums where he would be speaking in front of huge crowds where people would be shouting his words back to him before he could finish the lines of his poems, because people memorized his poems. He was such a beloved figure. And he was always kind of one of those names that was brought up as someone that could win the Nobel Prize, even before Dr. Zhivago, before he was writing it. And so I think that's important to put it into context. He was just absolutely the most famous living Soviet writer. When he wrote this novel, of course, everyone wanted to get their hands on it. And it's hard to kind of picture that type of celebrity today, but even going to Russia during my research trips, you see these giant monuments to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, like we would in the States see, you know, Lincoln and George Washington. Literature is at the heart and soul of Russia in a way that is hard to describe, I think, almost anywhere else in the world. And so you can see that Boris, being this famous poet and extremely handsome and charismatic, could command such a force that could later turn into a weapon.
So the great Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who died not too long ago, actually lived his last, 30 years here in Tulsa. To know him a bit and had some 2 or 3 like amazing long, kind of those like hour-long conversations with people. And he knew Boris Pasternak personally. Wow. And would tell me a couple of stories, and it was just strange because obviously Boris Pasternak is dead for 60 or 50 years now.
Yeah.
And to have someone who kind of had that direct connection, I think actually they're buried right next to each other now. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And he would tell me stories about poetry readings back in the 1950s and 60s in like soccer stadiums with thousands and thousands of people, as if it was the Beatles, basically, and it really is difficult to understand that reverence for writers. Do you think that in any way continues in Russia now, or was that something that was relegated to the past?
I do think that there is a different type of reverence there than there is in the States. Like I said, it's interesting because when I went to visit Boris Pasternak's grave, it wasn't some tourist attraction. It wasn't like going to Paris and seeing all these famous writers buried in the same cemetery. It was in a village cemetery. There was no signage or anything. But at the same time, everywhere you go, if it's Moscow, St. Petersburg, you see these giant monuments to these writers. And it is such a thing. It's a sense of pride that we've produced the best writers on earth that ever will live. And I mean, whether that's debatable or not, but I think it is deep in the heart of Russians, and still they will know their poetry in a way that I think many countries just can't fathom, knowing the lines or memorizing the lines to poems or knowing who their poetry history. These people were extremely powerful during their time, these voices, and such that, Stalin killed many of them to silence them. And Boris made out of it alive by luck and by many other things. And I think that it's interesting to see that poetry itself was seen as something that could disrupt the status quo, could disrupt government, because it's the voice of the people. And Boris, when he was speaking to soldiers and people, it wasn't just like the upper class or the upper, it was as the voice of the people. It was everybody. And so it wasn't something that was distinguished by, that's the intelligentsia or not. He really had a hold of all of the Soviet Union with his voice.
So obviously the book is about Boris. It's about Boris's wife, who suffered greatly for him. I mean, spending time in the Gulag, no less. But really, like, the heart of the book is this kind of secretarial pool, these typists, the CIA, the kind of people, the unseen people, the people that are doing this work, not getting the accolades and not really in the spotlight, but the people really doing that work. How did you kind of decide? Maybe you could introduce us to the characters of the book, but how did you kind of decide? Did it take a long time to try to figure out where to put the light of the book?
Yeah, the voice of the typist was extremely unexpected for me. It was the first voice that came to me when thinking about the novel. And I was reading, there's about 99, sometimes there was 100, now there's only 99 documents about this mission on the CIA's website. And I kept thinking about who were the people that had typed these documents. I don't know why. It's totally random. I wasn't thinking about the redacted names or the officers. I was thinking about who are the people that know what's behind the redactions. And these were these women. And the more research I did about the the early days of the CIA and seeing who was in these typing pools, what their lives were like, how many times they were way more qualified to do so much more at the CIA, but were put in secretarial roles or record keeping because they were women. It just kind of took on a life of its own. It's one of those research rabbit holes where I was reading it, I had the idea, I had the first lines of the novel in my head, and I just kept going down that hole and thinking about who were these women, what were their lives like, which then spawned, the voices of Sally and Irina, who come out of the typing pool to do more in the CIA. Sally is this glamorous woman who is tasked with prying secrets out of very powerful men and using her, conventional good looks to do so, and having that be a source of power for her. And then we have Irina, who comes out of the typing pool, and she is elevated to the role of a messenger because she can disappear into a crowd. She can go unnoticed. And it just was one thing after the next that I had these two characters, and I was thinking, what would their interactions be like? And that spawned, the love story that anchors the Western side of my novel. At the same time, I was thinking, I can't describe how important this novel was or why it was such a dangerous mission without describing what was going on in the East. And I was researching everything about Boris Pasternak, everything about Russian literature, everything I could get my hands on. And my interest again fell to the woman behind the man, which was Olga Ivanskaya, who was his mistress and his muse. And of course I was interested in the muse because she inspired the character of Lara in Doctor Zhivago, which is my namesake. So it was almost like I don't really plot or think ahead of time. I was letting my curiosity lead the way of how this novel would be structured. But again, that first draft was an absolute mess, just long, experimental, 160,000 words of going through all these different characters and what their experience with this book was like.
Is that how you usually go about writing? Meaning you like to kind of just throw it all out there and then start whittling it down?
Yes, I go along and I start deleting. That's my process, unfortunately.
Right, even though you said you had certain lines in your mind the whole time.
Yes.
Did those remain in the book as you had them in your mind even then?
Actually, yeah, because I originally, when I started writing the book, I was in my MFA program. And in the MFA program, for those of you that don't know, it's you workshop your work and you present it to your class and they give you feedback. And so I was writing almost like a short story treatment of the novel for that class so I could get people's feedback, because I knew I wouldn't have enough time to obviously write a novel and show it to everybody. And so it started off as a short story, all told by the typist. And some of those lines, I knew that the beginning of that typist story and the end is where I wanted to go with the whole story. I knew that it would be the anchor to the novel, and I just wanted to fill in everything in between. And I think, now I'm writing a new novel and I'm like, oh, I wish I could do it so much more time effectively. But I think I'm just that kind of writer that's going to write really long and then whittle it down and find it as I go along, which is fine.
The book has been really well received, and I've been so pleased to kind of see the success of the book. But, it was one of those books that when it came out, there was a lot of press about just the bidding war and all the things. And, all of a sudden your financial life is in the public, and people are talking about these numbers that are never what exactly they seem like. And people think about how things get split up between agents and all these things. But still, not every novel kind of comes into the world with this level of propulsion. And it's your first book, and you'd spent all this time on it. Obviously, that's an amazing thing to happen, and congratulations on that. But did you feel any pressure to kind of deliver on that?
I did, absolutely. And I think when you're writing a novel, especially your first novel, you don't know if it's going to be published. You don't know if you'll ever make $1 from it. And you're writing for years almost in a closet, especially as an emerging writer. And, when my novel went out to sale, I told my family and friends, don't talk to me about this. It could be months before I get, a plethora of rejections. And it was absolutely shocking to me that it went to auction. And so it was just absolutely, you know, within the first week I was talking to editors, and it just, it was like almost beyond belief, and it still is to kind of think about it. I was almost in a daze the whole time. And I think then, yeah, I was like, I gotta live up to this. And not only is this my first novel, which I think every novelist feels so much pressure, you know, once your book goes out into the world, no matter what is attached to it, and if there's any hype attached to it at all, but you feel a lot of pressure. And I think I think it took just time of getting to know that I think I did a lot of soul searching. This is like almost therapeutic, but like soul searching of, you know, this is something that's beyond my control. I wrote my book. I put my heart out there, and, you know, so whatever happens, happens. And that's up to the publishing industry. That's not really about me as a writer. So that actually, thinking of it from that mindset, took a lot of the pressure off before it came out. But, you know, it is hard. And I've had a lot of friends be like, oh, you know, this could be the downfall of many writers. And right now I just, I think of it as, you know, I think of it in a totally different way than I did when it first happened. I think of it as just this way that I can keep writing and keep producing books for years to come.
Would you imagine that most of the people who have read your book, at least by the when they read your book, had not read Dr. Zhivago yet?
I think
do you think that the book has led people to go read it after reading your book?
So it's interesting because in the United States, I think that is definitely the case. I think there are many people that have seen the film. The film adaptation is much more popular in the US than is the book. That's because of some translation issues that I think never were really worked out with the book. But there's other countries that my book has been translated and published in, such as Italy and Germany and other countries that everyone's read Dr. Zhivago. It's such a part of their culture that it's a totally different experience talking with the Italians than it is the United States. But I've had so many people tell me that they have gone on to read Dr. Zhivago or been encouraged to read it, which I think is absolutely brilliant and exciting and everything I hope for. It's almost a strange thing that I never could imagine that my book would inspire people to want to read more about or read Dr. Zhivago for the first time. And so I hope that's the case, but it is cool to see it in different countries and people's experiences with it.
I think the book has been translated into like 30 languages, right? Or at least sold to 30 different.
Yeah, and it's kind of rolls out over the next couple of years, but quite a few have published already.
Is Russia one of those countries?
Yes, and it hasn't published yet, so we'll see what happens with that. But I really have been receiving a few feedback from Russian Americans who really love the story and are happy that I told it. But we'll see what happens.
You know, obviously, you know, you're young enough to where the Cold War was basically over by the time you were of age to know anything about it. Have you always been interested in it? Like, where do you think your base interest for that came from? Because, you know, I was, I think, 9 when the wall came down.
Me too, yeah.
And so I remember it very vaguely, but I remember it as kind of like, yeah, it was a thing that happened, but I certainly didn't understand the geopolitical ramifications. I didn't understand the domino theory of like communism and all these. But I will say, you know, since that time, I've become more and more interested in it, I guess just because it's such a strange moment. And I guess also because I think it's impossible to not bring Vladimir Putin into this conversation and think about his role on the world stage has reignited interest because he was kind of a leftover remnant from that period.
Absolutely.
And very much, I think even has said so that he would prefer to go back to a world more similar to that. So do you think that all of that helped fuel some of the book's relevance?
Yes, definitely. And I think, so for just my own interest, I think my interest in the Cold War and various economical systems and governments and politics really stemmed from my college days. I studied economics, international studies, and political science. So I didn't study creative writing for any would-be writers out there. So I've been always obsessed with the effects of historical moments in the current day. And the Cold War is definitely one of them. I wouldn't say that I, was more obsessed with that than other periods of time, but it is really interesting to see how things repeat itself, and or if the Cold War was ever over, which we declared it being over, but how it cycles back to itself. And I think I'll always be interested in thinking about historical moments in time and how they're playing out again and again in the present day. I'm interested in that now at a different time, a slightly different time period. But Putin, I think it's interesting because I told this story to someone about how when I first started writing this, I was at a MFA program and agents come and scout out the young writers. And one of the agents told me that no one's interested in Russia anymore. And this is 2015. And I was, this is the first, I wasn't in the literary scene. This is the first time I'm presenting my work to someone in the business. And I was devastated. And another friend of mine who was writing about Ukraine, she said the same thing. And both of our books are out now. So that's, it says a lot about that. But it is like, I wasn't ever thinking that this would be so relevant today as it is, as when I first started writing it. It's almost a strange coincidence, which I think helped with, the interest in the novel in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting, the way things kind of are trending. We actually did do an event with Julia Phillips for Disappearing Earth. And, it's kind of, I guess, both are Knopf books.
Yep.
Out basically around the same time. And, both of you, obviously, having spoken now to both of you, were obsessed with Russia and kind of that stuff from a very, very young age, debut novels. And it's impossible to think that there's, not some broader interest at play in the world, where obviously those interests that you guys have had predated all this, but the timing, I guess timing really plays a big factor in everything.
I think so. And as a writer, you can't really think about that, but if it does kind of align in that way, I think that's why there's, more hype or some certain interest about books. But as a writer, I was always just interested in current events and thinking about historical ties to those events. And even now, I'm thinking about the 1930s as I'm really obsessed with for this next novel, and seeing a lot of mirroring in the present day. And I think that will always be part of my process is kind of evaluating what's going on and seeing it through almost a historical lens. And whether that lines up with what everyone else is interested in, you can't really even think about that. It could be or could not be.
So when did you go to Russia for the first time?
I didn't go until my first draft of the novel, which is in 2015. And I actually got to go and pulled my money together to go. It was, an expensive trip at the time. And it wasn't that I knew that I needed to go and be on the ground and walk those steps and visit the places that I'm writing about. And because I lived in DC for almost a decade. At that point. So I knew those streets. I knew what it was like to live there. And I did go back to DC while writing again. But at the same time, I went to Russia, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. But I will say, like, I'm looking at my old journals about what the notes I was writing. And it was all about, what the woods were like and what it smelled like and what it sounded like.
How broadly did you travel?
Yeah, so Moscow, I flew into Moscow, went to Peredelkino, which is where Boris's dacha is. And then I went to St. Petersburg at the end of the trip. So took the train across the country. But I would love to go back and actually spend a lot of time there. We'll see if that happens right now.
Having spent so much time there in your mind in the years and decades before that, did it live up to like the moment you stepped out into did it feel like you'd been there before? Was there some sense of like familiarity even though you'd never been there?
Definitely. That's interesting. No one's asked me that before because, you're reading so much about it. You're looking at all of these historical archives and photographs and documentaries, and you step out. And that first night we arrived in Moscow, we took I think we were, kind of out of it from the jet lag, but we just went out to the street that first night and walked the city, which is what I like to do anytime I do some traveling. It's just like walk aimlessly. And we ended up in Red Square, and it's snowing, it's March, and it did feel very much that I'd seen this before in some strange way. And it's an intangible feeling.
Yeah, it's almost like deja vu that could not possibly exist. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you speak any Russian, and did you have to kind of bone up on that before you went on this trip?
Yes. So I don't speak Russian, and I hired a tutor to help me with basics, but it was very difficult to get around without being fluent in Russian, I will say. And I have a funny story that, we go to Peredelkino, we get the train, go out there, and it's just a small village, and we're walking to the cemetery, and we need to find where Boris Pasternak's grave is. There's no markers. It's not like it probably would be in the United States where it's like, go this way, and here's a tourist booth and all this stuff. And this grave guy, he was like, had a shovel, and he was in the graveyard. He was working at the graveyard, and he sees me coming from like a mile away and knows that I just don't belong. Like, I'm an American. And he's like, Boris Pasternak. Because I kept rehearsing in my mind, how do I ask where this grave is, and saying it again and again in my mind. And he's just like, follow me, and he takes us into the woods, into the cemetery. But it was, I think one of my goals is to become well-versed enough in Russian to read Doctor Zhivago in Russian, because I think that's how it's meant to be read, and maybe someday.
Yeah, that's a good goal. Do you think that you could have written without going there if finances had not been available, or could you have written the same book without having gone there in person?
I think it would be different for sure. I think that even if you can learn so much through going to the library and getting those archival letters and photographs and resources, so much is available to you in the internet as well. There's a website that you can go and just take a visual tour around Boris Pasternak's house as it stood when he lived, and you can go to room, and that actually is really helpful. But just being there and having that almost sense of what it's like to feel like you're in that place and time, and looking at the birds and hearing the stream, it's almost a mystical kind of experience that cements itself in the writing. And so anytime I was thinking about where was Olga, where was Boris, what does it feel like to be in that location, I kept hearkening back to my experience there, even though it wasn't, months and months living there, but just my experience of touring that area. And with DC, it was the same thing. I lived in DC, and so much of, the typist experience mirrors some of my own of what it's like to walk to work in August in DC and show up, absolutely disheveled for an interview. Things like that, I think you can't get from a history book.
You saw the movie probably as a kid, right? I would imagine. Yeah. Well, before you read the novel, you've read the novel who knows how many times now. You've probably seen it a million times. And when you factor in like clips and bits and going back to the book, you've experienced both of these a lot. But when you see a film first, I wonder how long, if, or maybe never, when you see a film like that, then you read the book, your mind kind of casts those characters in your mind's eye as the actors. Do you still see those characters as Omar Sharif, as Julie Christie? Or was there a moment when you were able to kind of diverge those paths?
I think it changed. Like when I was in high school, I was definitely seeing Omar Sharif for sure. I think I hit a huge crush on him. But I think as you continue to read, they kind of become that, in your mind's eye of what that person looks like. And it takes on a different form. And now when I'm reading it, I kind of see this blend of like Boris as well, who was very much inspired his own character of Yuri. And so it's changed over the years, but I think the high school self would say it's Julie Christie and Omar Sharif.
You mentioned a little bit earlier the fact that this was an obsession and you were able to kind of let it go. Has it been difficult to kind of mentally move away from that space, having spent years and years there?
Yeah, I think when I submitted the final check of the copy edits, it was almost a sad moment because I think I could have just edited the book forever if given the chance. Like if they would have kept going, I'd be like, okay, let's do this. Let's keep inventing. But at that time, I think there was almost a mourning period. I think a lot of novelists feel that way. You know, you kind of have this letting go of those characters. And then I think when you're out on, you know, your book comes out and it's in the world, it is like almost a real severing. It's you're now moving on to something else, but in your mindset, it's hard to start thinking of a whole nother world when you're still talking about the world that you were in all the time. So I think that's a trick of moving on to the next book, is kind of thinking of it in a way that keeps that sacred for a time being. Like it's almost just yours for a time being.
Yeah. I want to pause for a second and do a commercial, which is that if you don't have a copy of The Secrets We Kept, or if you want to read it more than once, or you just want to give it as a gift, we have links here in the chat and you can get a copy. Beautiful new paperback right there. Perfect for your quarantine reading. You can just plow through this book. I know so many people would just read it in a day or two. So do that. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. So I'm curious if when you take a big book like Dr. Zhivago, which you've talked about, and you say you kind of marvel at the idea that a work of art could really change the world, impact the world, the power that art can have at that highest level. Do you think that books or anything are still having that impact now?
I think so. I think that even looking at the last few weeks and looking at people buying more and more books to help explain the world or help better inform themselves about what the world is about and what's happening in the world shows that books are still powerful.
Like if you look at the nonfiction New York Times bestseller list.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, you see all of these books that have been out. Some of them have been out for years at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And I think that is a sign of hope and a sign of thinking that books have the ability to change people's minds or change people's lives in a way that other art forms sometimes don't. And before, you know, that's a real concrete, I think, example. But for my own life, I know that reading books have changed my own life and have guided me to believe certain things and to fight for some certain things since I was a kid. And I know that since it has that personal effect on me, it is something that's worthwhile. And even if the CIA is not, you know, using a book as propaganda or governments fighting over it, that doesn't mean that it's not still powerful. And even if you kind of remove your gaze from the American mindset, you still see books being banned and writers being imprisoned in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and China, all over the world because of the words. And why is that? It's because that books have this power that has not been diminished. I mean, you can't spend, you know, 12 hours 20 hours reading a book and not come away from it thinking a little differently. So even if it's not, even if people say the novel's dead, I just never will believe it. I think that it is this art form that will live on, you know, well past us.
Yeah. No, it's funny, you know, whether we're talking about the novel or anything else, while I was asking that question, you know, you think about something like Hamilton, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hamilton's going to go down as kind of one of those like Mount Rushmore cultural events, and we have them occasionally. It's like your Beatles, your Harry Potters, your, you know, those things that are kind of there. And that will be one of those things. And I think every time we go, there's a gap between those. I often wonder, will there ever be something like that? And I guess the word is a phenomenon, some kind of cultural phenomenon that transcends the form and becomes bigger than the sum of its parts. And novels occasionally do that as well. And I guess in some ways it's the idea. But I do want to incorporate a question from, now this is a tricky question actually. I don't know how we do this without a spoiler.
Oh, I'll try my best. I don't want to give any spoilers though, but I'll try.
Well, the question is about the ending, so maybe we should. Maybe we will come back to that. I don't.
I
Yeah,
think
we don't.
the ending is what you think it is.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the question is, did you mean for the ending to be mysterious? That doesn't give anything away, but obviously, the ending was intentional. Whatever you did, right?
Yeah.
You meant to do what you did.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I
It
think
was
some
not an
people
accident.
found that way. Yes.
Yeah. Um, when is it? Do you find yourself trying to stay? I guess my question is this: you think about the Russian novelists, and a lot of it you think about the 19th century, and then up to Doctor Zhivago, and then unfortunately, you don't think of a ton from like the last half of the 20th century in terms of like the big
Yeah.
canon books. Um, do you try to read any contemporary Russian literature? Are we missing anything that we should be reading that's like great? I'm sure it's still happening.
Oh. Oh
You know?
man. I mean, I think there's been so much written about. It's difficult because I think Russia isn't embracing literature in the same way that it was, and maybe in fact suppressing literature in a way that harkens back to those Cold War days. So I couldn't say any actual Russian borns that I could point you to. But how about you? Like, would you?
No, I mean, I just, it's like once you get past like Master and Margarita and you get past
Yeah.
like that period, there's like the waves of obviously like early stuff like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all that. And then there's kind of that early to mid 20th century period. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure the politics and all that have influenced the way that is. But I think about that often a lot, meaning how many books are out there and other, especially books that haven't been translated out there that
Oh
might be
yeah.
the greatest book of all time, but it just never gets to us over here.
I'm sure it exists. I'm absolutely positive it exists, that it hasn't. I mean, you look at every year, you look at, who are these Nobel Prize finalists, and Americans just don't know who they are. And they haven't thought of it because Americans still think they're the king of letters, but that is absolutely not true. It just means that they haven't necessarily been translated
Yeah.
or given to us in the marketplace, which does not mean that they don't exist. So I absolutely believe there's some masterpieces I unfortunately am missing because of that.
That's a great point, actually. Will you have any role in working with the translators for all these 30 translations that are going to be happening or are happening now? Like
a little bit.
How do you work together?
So it depends on the publishing house, but sometimes they'll email me, ask me questions about my intentions, about would this word be a good fit in for that, but not, I don't have, too much say in that. And it's almost trusting those publishing houses that I've gone with to do the work and finding the right translator for the book. I think it's almost a leap of faith because it's been so many. I mean, I don't speak 30 languages,
Right.
But there have been, I think, the German, Italian, they've emailed me themselves, which has been really cool for me, and saying like, what do you think about this word replacing this word? Or the title has been changed in different countries too because of that. And so that's really fun for me. But I think Boris suffered from that himself. I mean, he had his book translated, and some of the translations were from earlier drafts that he never even intended to be the final product. And I think the English edition certainly has suffered for that.
Just to kind of wrap up a couple of questions, actually, you made me think of another thing there, which was, Boris Pasternak did not live to see the film version of the movie or of the book. And he didn't kind of get, obviously the book was a worldwide phenomenon, but the long tail of the book and the movie really probably went further than anyone could have imagined at that time.
Yeah.
Does he have any living relatives that are still around at all? And have you had any contact with any of those people, like at the estate level? Is there an estate, a Boris Pasternak?
Yes. So there are quite a few Pasternaks that still exist. And I had the opportunity, one of them is a scholar in Oxford who teaches about Boris and his translations. So I had the opportunity to meet with her, which was fantastic. I had the opportunity to hear from Olga's grandson, which was also quite astonishing. He lives in France now. So there are, it's interesting because, there's histories that people want to protect and histories that people don't necessarily agree with, because there's all these different takes on what happened. And was Olga good for Boris? Was Olga not good for Boris? And her history in itself has been suppressed for a very long time because people wanted to separate themselves from her, Boris's legacy from her. She was just this mistress. And so it's an interesting dynamic for sure, but there's definitely descendants for, not just on the eastern side, but in the west. I've been hearing from some old typists from the CIA pool of the late 50s and 60s, which has been amazing. And I got to go out for drinks with one of them in Pasadena, California, a few months before the quarantine, and she was in the typing pool in, I think, 62, which is like couple years after what I write about, which is amazing. And it's always terrifying to hear from these people because they either are excited or have a lot of qualms, but
like a list of corrections. Yeah.
A list of correction, but she loved it. So it was one of the best compliments I got.
You mentioned at the very beginning that when you were doing research, you were even going onto the CIA website and downloading PDFs that were redacted. I'm curious, why would something at this point about this be redacted? Like, what would still be confidential about something that happened this long ago?
I think the names of CIA officers who were in the field will always be redacted. I mean, even if you go to the CIA's headquarters, there's the famous monument of stars of officers who have died in the line of duty, but their names aren't there. It's a secret that oftentimes will go to the grave with the CIA officers.
Yeah.
So I think that's just part of their whole deal.
Yeah.
Even if they've been gone for 50 years, I think it's not going to be known. And it's interesting because I read there's been some accounts by, not siblings, sons and daughters of CIA officers. And, still it's speculation. I think my father was involved in this, or I think they did this. And I've gotten a lot of emails from people who said, I think my grandfather was involved in this. I'm not sure, but he had a copy of the CIA's Dr. Zhivago, so I think it's true. And so these are secrets.
Wouldn't it be cool to have a grandfather who was a spy? A grandfather was a spy. That would be just like the coolest thing ever.
I know. And I was like, yeah, he was probably a spy.
Might as well believe that. Hey, why not,
he speak other languages. Where did he go to school?
Well, I'm so thrilled that we were able to chat today. I want to remind everybody, if you haven't gotten a chance to read The Secrets We Kept, please click the link here in the chat and pick up your copy. We are really big fans. Thank you for doing this. I'm sorry we weren't able to have you here in person, but best of luck with the new project, everything that's going, and we really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I hope someday I can come there. Hopefully it's safe. But this has been absolutely great. I love you guys, and thanks for supporting the book.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye. We'll see you guys next time.
That's my dog.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.